Hello everyone and welcome to the channel of MERA25, the Italian party of DM25. Today I'm very excited to be joined by sociologist Ashley Frawley, who is a visiting research fellow at Matthias Corvinus Collegium Brussels and visiting researcher at the University of Kent, an author, senior editor of Compact magazine, and writes for media such as Unheard and Sublation. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us. How are you? Where are you joining us from?
Hi, thanks so much. I'm joining you from Athens today, and thanks so much for having me.
We have you here today because we want to discuss a number of topics, but they are all related to the question of end-of-life legislation, what that might look like in cases where it has already been applied, because while most of the left, I would definitely say in countries such as Italy, where the debate is now very heightened and there's a lot of controversy around it, but also a lot of hopes put on it from the left. In countries such as Italy, the left is extremely excited and hopeful about this kind of right being attained. And for me, just having seen how this kind of program has developed and where it's ended at in different countries, such as Canada, and seeing people such as yourself kind of take on the topic and really go deep into it, I am concerned. I am concerned because I'm not as just solely excited. I think there should be a right in extreme cases to access end-of-life procedures as a last resort, but I'm also quite worried about how it's gone, and so we just really want to prevent things like what's been happening in Canada from happening in countries like Italy too, where these laws to ever be put in place. So I'm gonna start with a question about our last interview on this channel. We have just had join us author and journalist Jeremy Appel. Much like yourself, Ashley, in his work, he warns of the direction programs like the Canadian Medical Assistance in Dying Policy MAID can descend into. We asked him about the state of these kind of policies in context of dire material conditions, bringing up your article in Compact magazine titled "Assisted Dying Isn't Freedom," in which you denounce that it has been argued that even in situations of injustice, MAID represents harm reduction for those living in a world that is unlikely to get better anytime soon. Not allowing people to access MAID because their request is driven by unjust social circumstances when those circumstances show no short-term chance of improving succeeds only in causing further harm. A good portion of the population seems to agree, you add, with a third of Canadians expressing support for MAID in situations where the recipient's only affliction is poverty. In a Jacobin article titled "The Canadian State is Euthanizing its Poor and Disabled," David Musgrove lays out that in the country's most populous province, Ontario, a recipient of disability support receives about $1,300 a month, a pittance they're meant to stretch to cover food, shelter, and other basic needs. Ontario Works, the province's welfare program, pays a current maximum of $733 a month. Meanwhile, rental costs for a one-bedroom apartment routinely push toward an average of $2,000 a month in many cities. In April, in Toronto, a one-bedroom apartment averaged almost $2,500 a month. What is the role, in your opinion, of such bleak material conditions in the application of programs like MAID and what dangers do such scenarios entail?
I mean, I think it speaks for itself, really. What I wrote in that piece for Compact, which I've written a few on this, obviously on the subject. I've written quite a lot on the subject, but a few for Compact. But obviously, that was a quote from an actual, ethics journal. That these were arguments that academics are putting forward. And it really speaks to this kind of end of history ethos, like things are not getting any better. So why not euthanize people? I mean, that's a real argument. And it's stunning. And I think you have to think not only about, rental costs and the cost of living and the cost of trying to get care in the community and this kind of thing. But also the cost of high-tech cancer care. And we've seen an enormous shift in institutions, which some people call the regulatory state or regulatory capitalism, where we've sort of hollowed out and emptied out a lot of our institutions. I've actually got another piece in Compact today talking about policing, as there's this increasing shift of, adopting the same logic of health as a regulatory institution. Where prevention is better than cure, which sounds great, right? But from that perspective, police shouldn't be going out fighting crime. That's dangerous, that's risky, it's costly. They should be preventing crime before it happens. So then speech is the ideal target, because it allows police to exercise their power of so-called prevention. And so then the target becomes normal society rather than criminals or whatever. In the same way that the focus of health has shifted from treatment of the sick to regulation of the well. So health becomes about regulation of the well, about telling people, how much salt they should have. And the left has really taken this on because it sounds really good. It sounds, I don't know, I guess it kind of has like a vaguely anti-capitalist ring, particularly in the United States, where you have like the, for-profit healthcare. But at the end of the day, it means that healthcare has moved away from costly treatment. It's seen as quite hubristic. And this really hit home for me recently because a family member was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in Canada. And it was really, he wasn't actually initially diagnosed with stage 4. He was diagnosed at stage 2 to 3, and they didn't even tell him. They just dragged their feet, because they knew the longer that they dragged their feet, the more this problem was going to take care of itself. Because, high-tech cancer care is extremely costly, and it's making little headway against the disease. There's a high rate of recurrence. And there's this sense that the population is too hubristic. And when they were talking to, I'm not supposed to say who it is. He's a very personal kind of person. But when they were talking to him, there was a very strong undertone of like, this is lifestyle. This was your fault. When it wasn't, actually. It was because of a bacterium is what had caused it initially. And they just did not, they offered him nothing, except they offered him death. And that was it. And I pushed, because I suppose they didn't expect. And also, like, we had, because I'm part Indigenous Canadian and this person is Indigenous. And we, in my family, we had a strong suspicion that it was like, oh, you drunken Indians, And so we kind of put the fear of death in them about like, are you being racist? But like most people can't do that. Most people don't have a family member with PhD. And I did like a full-on lit review. And I found actually there was a treatment. It was just very costly. And I pushed and I begged and I pleaded and we got that treatment. And he's cancer-free now. That was 2 years ago. He just visited me here in Greece. Plays hockey, living his life. And in his notes, you can even see that there is like an annoyance that he was treated. Like you can see the doctor wrote like, it was highly unusual. We're in uncharted territory here. And I'm like, we are not in uncharted territory. I did the lit review. But there's a sense of like, how dare you demand this? How dare you want to live? And I was talking about this in Brussels with a friend of mine when this was all going on. And she was also a cancer survivor. And I'm pouring my heart out. I was really emotional about it. And we're at a cafe. Well, it was after a conference, so we had gone, everybody, for drinks after. And this man at the table next to me is listening to what I say and what I'm talking about. And he cuts into my conversation. And he says, and I was saying to her, they just said, these are your options. You just have to accept it. It's death or that's it. Nothing else. And the man cuts in and he says, you do have to accept it. I work in public health. It is way too expensive to be doing all of this. And is it any surprise that Belgium is actually even worse than Canada? Belgium thinks that it's not as bad as Canada. It's worse in Canada because they're allowing euthanasia for psychiatric patients as well. And the chief of Belgium's largest insurance company explicitly said, we need to push more euthanasia or we're going to have a crisis in social care. What is happening to our societies where we are edging closer and closer to pushing euthanasia as a solution to social problems, pushing to killing people as a solution to social problems? That is absolute end of history, horrendous thinking. I can understand it on the right. It is unforgivable on the left. Unforgivable. And I say it's unforgivable. However, I will say, many years ago, maybe about a decade ago, I probably would have been in favor of euthanasia. I probably was passively in favor. It's not something that I had given a huge amount of thought to. I saw it happening in Canada, and I just passively thought, oh, terrible suffering at the end of life. I'm a liberal type. I care about people. That sounds fine. And I did nothing. I said nothing because I didn't know. And it wasn't until I saw stories trickling through that I started to realize, obviously, this regulatory state is not out here suddenly worried about your freedom. Oh, no. In every other area of life, your freedom is a risk and a liability. They're very worried about the exercise of human freedom because it makes people very difficult to predict. And you need predictability in a regulatory state. All of a sudden, my freedom is sacrosanct. Oh, that's a bit odd, don't you think? Oh, it's the freedom to end my life when I'm costly. And nobody thinks like, you're feeling suicidal and you call a hotline and it's like, it's almost literally this. Oh, hi, you're feeling, oh, that's terrible. But are you disabled? If you're disabled, we'll send you to a doctor who'll do it for you. But if you're able-bodied, oh, never mind. We will convince you not to. It's like, I'm sorry, are you costly to the state? Then we don't care. But are you still is there still some life left in you that we can use up? Okay, we'll tell you not to do it. This is what was going on, and it had nothing to do with freedom. And I saw these stories trickling through of people who were desperate. And the story that finally changed my mind was Roger Foley, who I've become kind of friends with now. When he reached out to me after I wrote about him. And he wanted to live, and he was quite explicit about how he wanted to live, but he needs costly care in the community. He needs community care. We've had a long period of deinstitutionalization and so on, and so you need community care if you're very disabled often for the most part, depending on your level of disability. And they refused to give it to him. And they come in and they're like, yeah, we'll give you, you could just apply for an assisted. That would be so much easier for us. And he had the wherewithal to record it because he knew something bad was happening. But how many people trust the doctors, trust their judgment, feel bad about being a burden? And in fact, if you look at surveys of the reasons why people do this, is fear of being a burden is at the top of the list. And even I talked to my mom, who's quite passive. She's a bartender. She's not very educated or anything. And I'm like, Mom, this is a really bad thing. And she's like, oh, people don't want to be a burden, That's not the first thing that she said to me. I was like, Mom, you took care of your mother while she was dying. Was she a burden on you? Oh my gosh, no. Those were wonderful times. So much was said and so on. Yeah. When people are dying, they're still living. I want to be, I can't remember who said it, was a vicar from the UK says, I want to be a burden on my loved ones as I die. And I want them to be a burden on me. It's called love. This is our relations to each other, and this idea that it's we fit everything into this economic plan and it just doesn't work. Well, I can't fit you into the balance sheet. You just got to make your way out. But you give it this wash, this social justice wash, and people eat it up. I'm sorry, we need to think about this. This is really bad. And people are trying to separate it from the history of euthanasia. You can't separate it. The arguments are the exact same. I know now he's like, oh gosh, everything is Hitler. But I mean, really do go and read some of the very first arguments. These are not blueprints for genocide. These are about compassion, freedom, caring. The document from 1920 from which you get the phrase life unworthy of life, it is about compassion. It's about ending lives that are not worth living, that you would not subject yourself to if you had the choice. It was very convincing, and it was about care. Okay, we can't be blinded by this. We have to really think about what we're doing. We're not acting in a blank canvas. We're acting in an economic context in which capitalism has an extraordinarily anti-human drive, and it is resolving that drive now against humans. And if we don't fight for humanity, the machine's gonna eat us up.
Yeah, and we are gonna come back to the anti-human drive of capitalism, and that is everywhere in the zeitgeist. But before we do, I wanna read again from your compact article. One of the alarming events related to MAID that you cite sees a disabled man repeatedly requesting assisted living, but being offered assisted dying instead, and being reminded of the expense of his hospital stay, much like you were telling us right now. In our interview with Appel, he gave us similar examples to this, which go shockingly beyond end-of-life instances that would reasonably require assisted dying procedures. Could you please also take us through some of the most alarming instances you have become aware of? You have already told us kind of a couple of disturbing cases, but is there any other that you would like us to know about?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of interviews around this for my research, and it's been really difficult, and I've often cried while I was doing them. It's just, and there are some examples that I can't really bring up when I do press interviews because they're too horrible to believe. It sounds like tinfoil hat territory, like stories about people who might have survived an accident, for instance, if they but would be severely disabled, whose family was pressured to end life support for organ donation. And so that's the kind of thing that sounds really cuckoo, like. But Canada is one of the biggest providers of organ donation, and of organs for donation, and there is a move there, and in fact, one of Roger. I shouldn't say that actually. One of the doctors involved in one of these cases has pushed for, I've just given it away, but has pushed for euthanasia by organ donation. Because when you euthanize someone, there's some organs that are not therefore donatable. And if you euthanize by organ donation, you can take much more. So, yeah, and he's been pushing for that. So those are like the sort of tinfoil hat territory kind of things. But the other thing is that once you create this kind of process, you remove the power of human judgment and you deflect it onto a bureaucratic process. This is like textbook banality of evil, right? It's this deflection of judgment onto bureaucracy. And what winds up happening is the patient is like, well, I am a candidate for this if the doctor says I am, right? I'm deferring to their superior judgment. And the doctor's like, you're a candidate if you think you are. Because this is like, they've been taught, patient-centered medicine. The patient doesn't necessarily know that. They are still operating this old paradigm of like, depending on social class, it depends, but often they're operating this old paradigm where the doctor has this like professional judgment and they know best. And the doctor's like operating this paradigm where like, the patient is an expert in their own illness. So you have this bizarre situation where people are like, well, you are if you say you are, and I am if you say I am. But also this like box ticking exercise where it's like, well, I've covered all my bases. And that means that there's no one's at fault here. So I'm not going to think about what I've done or what I'm doing because I have ticked all the boxes and that absolves me of moral responsibility. And an example of this was Christopher Lyon, whose father was killed by euthanasia a few years ago. He's written about it. You can have a look. It's the saddest story. It's just incredible. But his father had suicidal ideation throughout his whole life, and he was not terminally ill. And he started to kind of get pulled into this logic of like, this is the ultimate expression of your autonomy. And this is the same thing that happened to Roger Foley. At first, he was pulled into this logic of like, this would be an expression of your autonomy. This would be so great. And then he kind of snapped out of it. But unfortunately, his father, Christopher Lyon's father, didn't. And they don't tell, because of doctor-patient confidentiality, they don't tell the family this stuff, right? And there's many stories of people who find out after the fact that their suicidal parent is gone, because they don't say anything. So he found out with very little time. I can't remember how much, like 3 days before his father was due to be euthanized. And he's freaking out. He's got no time to try, and he's like, well, surely these people will know. I will tell them. Look, he's got a history of suicidal ideation here. I need a psychiatric assessment. And I can't. I'm mixing up the fine details of the story. But one of the people involved in the process said to him, "Well, we can give you a psychiatric assessment, but it'll just be a formality that will provide cover." Literally said that. It will just be a formality. We're going to tick the boxes no matter what. And it means that I am absolved of guilt here. As long as all the boxes are ticked, I'm absolved of guilt. And of course, because it's such a profound thing to do, to be killing people, there are actually very few doctors that are willing to do it. And you have a situation where a very small number of providers is responsible for hundreds and hundreds of deaths, which is weird in and of itself. They have this, Christopher Lyon's done research on this, and they have this weird kind of like God complex, and it's very strange. But also, it means that people don't want to be, people who are a bit squeamish about it don't want to be involved, even in the panels or in review. So it tends to all be stacked with pro euthanasia advocates. So even the people who are, who are supposed to be responsible for reviewing this and making sure all the boxes are ticked, are people who are in favor of it anyway. So those are a few examples from my own research, my own interviews. For instance, in Belgium, I spoke with a woman whose mother had quite advanced cancer, and she had agreed to undergo an experimental surgery, which she knew was not going to save her life. But she was so grateful to the doctors who had been treating her for, I think, about 2 years that she was ill. She wanted to do it because the data that would come from the surgery could be used to save people's lives in the future. And my interviewee said she wanted it as a gift to the doctors. So she comes out of the surgery. She's like quite, I think she was, quite groggy and not able to really speak or anything like that. And her sister had made the decision to euthanize her while she was in that state. And there was nothing my interviewee could do about it. And so she gets this call, and she's supposed to go to the hospital for this wonderful celebration of life as we say goodbye to your mother. She wasn't going to die. She had at least 2 months left, right? During which they were going to be able to get this data, and during which there was lots that could be said and done, and that she wanted to spend that time with her mother. She wanted that time with her. And she said to me, I will never forgive her, to her sister. She doesn't speak to her sister anymore. I will never forgive her that they took that from me and they took that from her. And what she's supposed to do, she's supposed to go into the hospital and like kick up a fuss when everyone's like, you're ruining the occasion. This is supposed to be a happy thing. And yeah, they euthanized her mother in front of her. And not only that, and it gets worse, and there's in ways that I can't really talk about it because you'll need to call a hotline after. It's really awful because the mother had been given a lot of pain medication throughout her illness and had been addicted to the pain medication, and so the drugs didn't work at first. And this is the thing that people don't talk about. It's not like the advocates scare you with like painful death. You're gonna have a painful death. You're gonna die in horrible pain. Why would you allow anyone to die in horrible pain? And it's like, no, most deaths are not horribly painful. And euthanasia is not a guarantee of a perfect death either. And in fact, we have this debate when it comes to prisoners. When it comes to prisoners, we're like, well, is it actually painless? They drown in their lungs. Is that painless? We don't see it on the outside. It looks painless. Is it for us or is it for them? But we don't have this when it comes to euthanasia. Oh, you're scaremongering. Meanwhile, they can scare you all the time about having a painful death. Don't worry, we'll offer you this way out. No, it was a horrible death for her mother. It was a really awful thing to see. And it was very traumatic for the nurses that had to do it. And also, it was not autonomous. It was not chosen. It was against the will of that woman. She expressly wanted to live. But when you have this process in place, it becomes another Tuesday. It doesn't matter. And I said to her, like, why didn't you, press for criminal charges? And she's like, no, this is so common. And I'm already going through the death of my mother. I don't want to like kick up a fuss and all of this kind of thing. She only had 2 months. So like, it didn't really matter. You can do what you want. And they're euthanizing dementia patients as well. there's an awful story that went through that went to in the press and actually did go to the courts, of how they mixed a sedative into the tea of a woman and then forcibly held her down while they euthanized her, a woman with dementia. So it's not about autonomy. When there's no chance of autonomy, they'll fall back on something else. Oh, it's in your best interest. And the answer is, these people, it's costly to keep them 2 months longer. It's costly to take care of a dementia patient. It's easier to euthanize them. That's just the answer. That's just what's happening.
Yeah, it's very disturbing, and I will say the approach of regarding this and, using adjectives such as like, this is so beautiful and like, we want to be compassionate, that just, to me, completely fits into the left's tendency, now the current left's tendency to look for a victim and be just like so glad when you find one that is as non-agentic as possible. That's just like, it's so twisted to me, and yeah, it's definitely something that I've seen attached to this issue. I want to bring up one of the most disturbing aspects of Canadian Made, which I believe we should be extremely careful with when advocating for any end-of-life legislation here in Italy, which is that it's being presented to patients by medical providers. In your compact article, you also highlight as one of this program's biggest flaws that, given its intricacies, both physicians and patients are relinquishing autonomy to a bureaucratic process, which you were kind of touching upon earlier. What would you say are the most alarming issues Made has, which we should avoid repeating?
I mean, I feel like I've kind of reiterated them, but the end goal is not the protection of autonomy. And it was, and so it means that if you are not going to be productive, you are not valued. Your suicide will be fast-tracked. And that's just, it is a problem with the underlying ethos and ideology, the economic context in which this has come up. And I think when you have that, you're not going to have, it's impossible to have any kind of a program that people imagine, which is about compassion and respect and so on. I think this really came to the fore. I was on Times Radio recently, just sort of reviewing the papers as I often do. And the first story, as it happens, was euthanasia. And I was like, oh boy. And the trouble is, like, I've been working on this for so long and I've become so passionate about it, I forget what it sounds like to somebody who doesn't know all of this stuff. So I probably sounded crazy. And I was like, this is really bad. And most people are like, oh, really terrible pain at the very end of life. That's all this is about. And of course, that's what advocates tell you at the very beginning. They purposely do a slow education process because most people are on board with that. Most people are not on board with the quite extensive and permissive programs that advocates actually want and eventually do get, which I think we'll come to. And so they're like, what is this woman talking about? That's not going to happen. And and advocates will purposely say, oh, well, we're not like Canada. We have a completely, but you can look on MCC Brussels site. I've done a study of this. Every single country in Europe that has legalized it is currently expanding it or has expanded it. Because, these organizations don't just disband once they get like a minimal euthanasia law. They keep pressing. They bring cases to the courts. They do this on purpose. That is the point. They want a permissive euthanasia law. They don't want something with strict safeguards. And they will always start with 6 months left to live, which is arbitrary anyway, because no doctor can predict how long you're going to live. But then they will say, this is arbitrary. You're discriminating. So then they'll extend it to a year. And then a year is just as arbitrary. And then they'll bring cases of people with disabilities, and that's how it gets to disabilities. And it's the same thing every single time. They know it, that these groups are very organized. They know exactly what they're doing. And it's not a conspiracy. This happens in all sorts of social problems, all sorts of social movement organizations and NGOs and lobby groups. They know what they're doing. It's called the slow education process. It's been studied for decades. They start with something small, that they know the population can get on board with, and then they expand it after that. Once they get a foot in the door, then they wedge the door open. It's just, that's how social policy often works, and that's what they're doing. So if you think you can have like a just at the very end of life, you can't. Anyway, so knowing that most people, I forget that most people do not know this. It's not obvious to them. So I'm like, this is about hatred for disabled people. Like, this is, I'm just listening to this phone in, and people are like, oh boy, if I can't use my arms and legs, just euthanize me. It's like, what do you tell? That's what a lot of disabled people just live like that. They require care, and you're just like, well, obviously that's not a life worth living. What do you say? That's like the disability rights movement has been arguing against for 20 years. Just because I can't use my limbs or whatever doesn't mean I can't contribute to society. I just need help to live in society. Nope, just euthanize me. And it's scary too, because, sorry, I'm going off on thousands of tangents as I'm trying to tell a story, but it's very scary because when you first realize you have a disability, when you become disabled, it's really hard to come to terms with. And some people do become suicidal, and euthanasia will get you at that moment. It'll get you at that moment and say, yeah, your life actually isn't worth living. And some people come through the other side of that, and they do manage to, with support, they can live in the community, and their lives are just as worthwhile as ours. But they will tell them, no, actually, it's true. Your life isn't worth living, and they will euthanize people. And I've seen many cases of this. People who have a stroke who say, look, if I can't walk again within a year, euthanize me. Look, it might take some time to get used to the fact that you will not be able to use your legs, but doesn't mean you can't live, that your life is without value. Anyways, so I'm listening to all these like phone-ins and so on. I'm like, this is crazy. This is, and I said the thing that I said earlier, where I said nobody cares about autonomy in society. Like, autonomy is seen as a risk in every other instance except this one. Suddenly, autonomy is sacrosanct. We should be very, very suspicious of that. And then the very next, and they said, no, autonomy is so important. Commercial break. Next story, junk food. Junk food and obesity. Suddenly, the man I'm speaking to, who just sang the praises of autonomy from the rooftop, starts saying, well, are people really capable of making informed decisions? Suddenly, autonomy is in question because he doesn't like fat people. So, and I said to him, I'm really sorry, but you just proved my point. And he got really angry with me, and I had to be like, Jonathan, I didn't mean you. But this is, they don't care about autonomy. They care. You are a risk. Your autonomy is a risk in every other area of society. As a good citizen, you are brought up to learn that the exercise of your free will is a risk to yourself and others. You are constantly taught to defer your judgment to frameworks, to therapeutic guidance, all of these sorts of things. Now in this one area, suddenly autonomy is sacrosanct. It is not. It is not. It is about the human being as a risk and as a cost. And when it exists in that framework, you cannot have a humane euthanasia policy. And also for legal reasons, as I said, and because of the way that lobby groups work, you can't have a restrictive euthanasia policy. It always expands, always. So that's the most worrying thing about the policy. It will never stop. It will never stop.
Yeah, I mean, something that I find pretty awful about the current state of things and the zeitgeist we have right now is that we are being asked to rationalize even only the most intimate parts of our lives, such as, for instance, our love life, who we like, who we don't like. Meanwhile, our political involvement, if it's there at all, it's supposed to be and celebrated when it's extremely emotional and sort of based in our personal trauma, which is supposed to also be attached to our identity. Meanwhile, you're supposed to exercise this autonomy, which we're going to come back to later, by the way, in areas of your life that are not necessarily supposed to be this sort of like rational, organized sphere, such as love, death, right? Meanwhile, politics is all about hop on Instagram and tell me about your most traumatic moment of when you were assaulted, right? And this is something I try to bring up like a broken record because I just find it like one of the worst aspects of the current general culture, but also of the left, because the left, to me, sadly, we have been adopting this approach. I want to also cite your article in Unheard, Assisted Dying Advocates Are Losing Their Compassion, in which you assert that at first you thought that Matthew Paris, whose viral Times article you analyzed, just wasn't considering the fact that legislation inevitably expands in these ways. Initially, stringent safeguards, you write, inevitably fall on grounds of discrimination, pushing more and more groups into its purview. Italian MERAtv supports end-of-life laws from a secular standpoint and aligned with judiciary pronouncements and with healthcare institutions' directions in terms of ethics and civil rights. Personally, I believe in some extreme cases, people should be able to access end-of-life assistance as a last resort, as I was discussing with Appel in our previous interview. And both the party and myself personally believe that end-of-life laws must never become a substitute for institutions or policies such as a robust universal healthcare. Do you believe there is a way at all for an end-of-life law to work in a manner which does not devalue life, or are you fundamentally opposed to any being put in place at all?
I mean, I don't know. In a far future society, perhaps, with conditions quite different from ours, it might be a question to seriously discuss and debate in society. I don't know. But I think now, I really cannot stress this enough. The idea of only in extreme cases is often what gets the laws passed at the beginning. But you can't stop it because you are creating an inherently discriminatory law. It will fall. Because you are saying, like, you are differentiating this extreme case. Well, what makes this not extreme then? It becomes arbitrary, it becomes discriminatory. You can't do that. You can't have a law that discriminates. It will fall. That's what they always do. They will say, if you're saying this is a right, then you can't stop it from being given to more and more people, because people are saying, well, I am being denied a right. And even if you don't frame it as a right, there are still other ways that it gets expanded, because there are groups and in Italy, part of the reason why you're right now developing legislation is because you have tireless lobby groups there that have been pushing for this, and they take cases on purpose. They get arrested. Activists get arrested on purpose to take this stuff to the courts, and they will keep doing that because they don't want just extreme cases. They want it for people with disabilities. And and you will be convinced too. Mark my words. I was, again, as I say, I do a lot of these like radio phone-ins or whatever. And how many people were talking about the horrible disability? It's often men talking about their wives, by the way, which is weird, about how their wives became terribly disabled, and they discuss so on and on and on about the disability. And people are like, oh my God, that sounds horrible. Yeah, I'd rather die. And you will start to become it. You'll move away from the extreme case. You're going to go to disability, and you can't stop it. It will not stop. But let me tell you, we do actually have euthanasia in most countries, more or less legalized in extreme cases. It is strictly illegal. However, it does happen where people are at the very end of life, and a doctor will, or a health professional will judge in the interest of the patient to give a dose of painkiller that will shorten life. But they kind of know, they can judge this person has like less than 2 weeks. And in most countries, this is essentially legal because it is the purpose, the intent is not to kill the patient. The intent is to relieve their suffering. And the secondary effect is that it shortens their life, causes respiratory failure. And in most countries, that is actually legal. And the thing is, this is the best way to do it because the doctor knows if I get this wrong, I'm going to murder this person. And there, not only is that a blight on my soul, on my morality or whatever, but also I could go to jail. And so the doctor has to make, the health professional has to make a profound judgment about what they're doing. And they take that on personally in their, in their professional capacity. And you can say, and people will say, oh, but if we legalize it, then that will open it up so that we're not abusing things. And we're not going to have these like healthcare serial killers that were abusing that, like Harold Shipman. And it opens it up to scrutiny. But as I said, no, when you legalize it, you remove that. That's it. I don't have to think about it anymore. Boxes ticked. Tons and tons of people get euthanized for whatever reason. Because, boxes have a semblance of being ticked, all good. But if it's like most people are going to exercise this kind of very, very careful judgment, and that's essentially how it works. Without regulation, and people are scared of this because they just love regulation. Regulation solves all problems. But it actually does regulate itself because people are making a very profound judgment about the ending of somebody's life. And that is actually a very common thing that happens. And that is effectively a form of euthanasia, except that you were quite certain it's at the end of this person's life. And there's no danger that you're going to go to somebody with disabilities and like put them into a coma or something like that to ease their suffering, because this person isn't going to live for a very, very long time. But a person with disabilities will, and the family usually will kick up a fuss. People will usually kick up a fuss, as they do now with euthanasia, but there's nothing they can do about it because it's legal. So there is a way, in extreme cases, at the very end of life, to ease people's suffering that does effectively end their lives a little bit sooner. We already have that. And it is regulated by human beings exercising their judgment. And I think that's the best way to do it.
And we are actually now going to get to these ideas of, an autonomous subject, where does rationality fit, and the trust in ourselves as people. And I want to preamble this last point that I want to bring up by commenting on a great thing you said on a Sublation interview, which honestly kind of made me cry a little. You were talking about one of your children, and apparently you and her were discussing what is the meaning of life.
My favorite.
And she said, I love that interview. She said, the meaning of life is us in the world. And I was like, that is exactly right. That is it. That is it. That should be
my child, you can tell.
Core. Exactly. I want my child to be that way too one day, please God. That's just, to me, that should be the very core of left politics, right? Sadly, though, it's not. Like, right now, I think that's the very opposite of what we've been doing for the last decades, tragically. And now I want to come to my question, right? Because in the past, I have argued that human life is being profoundly devalued and eugenicist tendencies are being adopted well beyond the far right, as we are deemed to basically be deplorable viruses on the earth by large parts of the environmental movement, while we see trends such as dog moms and family abolition flourish. I believe this is closely linked to what George Hoare calls in Damage Magazine, hatred of the human, and we'll link an article, a brilliant article down below. It's not just that we have lost the rational, agentic, working class subject, we have descended even lower into basically hating ourselves and our very existing. Your work has greatly helped me, like I was telling you before, think along these lines. In your Unheard article, you write that, and I read, the Marquis de Condorcet, writing at the end of the 18th century, dreamed of a world in which the human lifespan would know of no upper limit. He could see the possibilities of a world just beyond the horizon in which humanity would realize its obstacles were not ingrained in its nature nor inscribed by God, but out there in the world waiting to be understood and rooted out. Enlightenment philosophers had looked down into the cradle of the human subject at its birth. that subject that would be the bearer of liberty, equality, fraternity, that subject that for the first time in human history would decide its own fate. And we've actually done a short video on this, which we will also link for our audience below. I firmly believe what you convey in this quote. This is, like I said, should be the core of left politics. How is this change in the perception of the role of humanity in the world linked to end-of-life loss? And how can those of us who share a hunger for this to be how we regard ourselves as humans bring forth this notion, and what would a left which adopted it look like?
Oh, so there's so much in there. As you were reading that, it's my own writing and I'm like tearing up. It's so funny. But the reason why I was getting kind of emotional is that I am so dejected and so impatient because that world is completely possible. It's completely possible. But we tried so many times to get there and we kept failing. And there's this wonderful little book that's very fun called At the Existentialist Cafe, which is a great summer read. I highly recommend it. But there's a point in the book where the author seems a bit dumbfounded about why Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, intelligent as they were, put all their hope in the USSR, flawed as it was. And the answer is because they knew if this didn't work, we were never going to try again. And it didn't work. Instead of utopia, instead of the world of human freedom, we got the exact opposite. The 20th century showed us what happens when human beings try to put their hands on history. We got gulags, we got industrial killing. That's what happened. And now we look at ourselves and we say, maybe we were wrong. Maybe we were too hubristic. Maybe it is something in us. And that right-wing fantasy that blamed everything on the human subject has become a popular prejudice. They say, see, we told you so. It's just us. It's the rot is at the core of the human being. And no matter what you do, it's always going to be there. It's better if we didn't even exist, actually. Where we have this, I really recommend, I wrote a piece in Compact called The World Without People, where I talk about this dialectic that exists within capitalism of a profound reliance upon the human and a profound disgust with the human. Capitalists are always trying to relieve themselves of this, their reliance on humanity. They hate it because, first of all, it's the source of all profit, but they make profit when they push human beings out of the process. They're the biggest cost. Like they're annoying. They need to eat. They need to sleep. Sometimes they refuse to work. Ugh. Like, can we just replace them with humans? Replace them with robots. And so there's this powerful sort of anti-human drive. And if there's nothing to push back against that, it becomes just that anti-human kind of pro-human possibility, anti-human destruction is going to be resolved on the side of the anti-human. And that's what I think is happening. And that's what I describe in that article. And I give a few examples. And one of them is euthanasia. But if you look at like tech gurus, they talk about they really talk badly about human beings. Like, who cares if we get rid of humans? They're like weak and slow and stupid anyway. Instead, for all of the sci-fi books that we all bring up, 1984, Brave New World, why don't we ever, or like HAL 9000 or whatever, why don't we ever bring up Isaac Asimov's Last Question? It was my favorite sci-fi story. I read it to my girls as well. I read it to my children. And it's a wonderful example of how alienation, the movement of our human capacities outside of ourselves, can resolve in a profoundly, powerfully human future. And, people will critique alienation. They'll say, oh, our creativity moves outside of ourselves and we become alienated from it, and it confronts us as an alien and destructive force. Totally true. Absolutely. But the end result of that dialectic, so the production process gets broken down into all these little aspects, and then it comes back together again through that alienation, through that horrible anti-human process, it's true, can come back together in a higher form so that I can think of something and create it. And that is becoming possible right now. Like, you know, we're podcasting right now. This used to be something that required like big, you know, towers and so on, and recording studios, and we can just do it with our laptops right now in a overpriced mic. And it's cheap, you know, that allows us to express ourselves and our humanity and come together again. So that alienation can have a productive side to it. And so there is a possibility for a better future. Technology can open up, can be our way of having a conversation with ourselves, and opening up a profoundly human future. But if we do not have that, then the destructive side of that technology will win out, which is that it displaces humans, which is that's the dystopia that people, oh no, it's like, every single, like the Terminator, it's every terrible thing that is all coming true. And by kind of defaulting to that negative side, we're like, well, that's just our future, isn't it? And there's nothing to fight for because we've lost an optimistic vision of what the future could be. We've lost that optimism that Condorcet had, for instance. It's actually an amazing optimism because Condorcet wrote that book, which is one of the most optimistic books I think ever produced by humanity, when he was being hunted down during the terror after the French Revolution. So and he was eventually killed. And he had this incredible optimism. He said, even, you know, he realizes that even as I go, the future holds something for us. And that's unbelievable. It's amazing. And we've completely lost that because of what we experienced in the 20th century. And I don't know if we can gain it again. But I wish so much that we could do that. And sort of going back to, like, how do we do that? You have to have a human-centered morality. There is nothing else. It's just us. And we have realized this. That's also the lesson that the 20th century gave us. We thought that there would be something that would stop us, right? Like God would step in, an angel, second coming of Christ, something. But there was nothing stopping it. We came to the edge of the abyss, and we were just throwing each other down into it. That was the lesson of the 20th century. But Viktor Frankl has a wonderful line in Man's Search for Meaning, where he says, yes, it was human beings that created the gas chambers, but it was also human beings that went into those gas chambers with their heads held high, singing, praying. So it's humans on it's all of us. It's humans. We have the power and the ability. It was humans who tried to put a stop to euthanasia and actually did manage to stop it. It stopped it even within Germany. It was actually families, the clergy, that were able to kind of at least push it underground to a certain extent. And then, of course, liberating Germany. Obviously, the Russians sort of marching in and so on. It was us. We put an end to it too. And so the thing that my 5-year-old at the time had said, that the meaning of life is us, I had to record it because I was like, no one's going to believe this. It's one of those things where it's like, my child said this. And it's like listening to them play with their dolls and they're having this conversation. I was like, oh my God, what did you just say? Record. I know that's horrible, but I wanted to remember that forever. Because the thing is, obviously, like, it's a cheap argument to say, out of the mouth of babes, she just intuited this. She did not. I have read to these children since they were in their cradle, literally. Whatever book I am reading, I just read it out loud. And it has become like a ritual where they can't fall asleep except to the sound of my voice. And so I will just read to them whatever I happen to be reading. And at the time, I was reading Martin Haglin's This Life. And that was the moment when I heard them talking to each other that I realized they were actually understanding they had started to understand what I was reading to them. Because the thesis of this book is that, and she had distilled it in the most extraordinary way, that the meaning of life is us, that there is no moral compass beyond the human, that we are the measure of goodness, the longevity and comfort of our lives, our pursuit of meaning. We are the measure of morality. There is nothing beyond us. We need a human-centered politics, a human-centered morality. And that, for some weird reason, has like a right-wing ring to it, which is insane. But like, an animal doesn't care if a lion isn't going to care if it kills the last antelope, but a human being will. And it's rather unfortunate because the awful destructiveness of capitalism is displaced onto the human. It's like, we do this, we do that. Well, we might wish to do all sorts of things, but we can't do it because we're trapped within the profit motive. You can only do it if it's profitable, or if some philanthropist will pay you to do it. That's the extent of it. We have lots of technology. We have the ability to solve all kinds of problems, but we are stuck. We're stuck. We can't do anything. And so I wish that we were using our extraordinary intellect, our powers of understanding, to figure out a way out of this. There's got to be a way out of it. What comes next is already here. It's like within feudalism. Feudalism was pregnant with capitalism. Capitalism is pregnant with the future. And the future could be something awful. It could be some kind of, I don't know, neo-feudalism, this awful like anti-human world of reduced population, whatever might inject something into the profit, right? Or the future could be us trying to move beyond this, to seize the possibilities that became real, if in embryo, at the end of the 18th century. We have to decide that, and we have to chart that path. And instead, we got lost in this awful detour of anti-humanism. And we're never going to get out of this. These contradictions have to resolve themselves, and they will resolve on the anti-human side. And that means destructive wars, increasingly deep economic crises, the human getting pushed out of the process, the difficulty of proving my life has value. I deserve to live. That's a hard argument to make. If you have a disability, that's a hard argument to make. If you're at the end of your life, to say like, the last days of my life, I am still alive. It's an impossible argument to make. That the human life has value above everything else. Who says that now? But every human mind is a mind that can think. Every human being is capable of understanding the world and working on it and changing it. And we can do that. We just have to put the human back at the center.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's happening now is instead, very much like you said, all the blame is being put on the individuals. And also the idea that if anything can be, corrected or arrived at is our inner psychic selves and our sort of like authentic selves, and like that's where the struggle is, instead of out in the world, which as an organized working class we surely could affect and change, but sadly that's not even where the problem is being placed, because we're being told again the problem is ourselves. And I mean, to me, this image of the virus on the earth and truly seeing, and it sounds really stupid, but it's something that is so telling. You see dogs being like treated with such reverence compared to people. Same for the planet, and the fact that it's become sort of a right-wing, I mean, it's supposed to have become a right-wing thing to say that, these things don't come before us, and that we need to have that ambition that you were mentioning in the beginning of this conversation, right? Being more ambitious because we want more and we deserve more. Because as workers, actually, we literally have built more. We have built pretty much everything. So we should demand that we get to use it too, right? And I don't know, this is why people tell me I'm obsessed with the end of history, but all of this does have to do with that profound loss, right? And the loss of this agentic subject that collectively was the working class, no?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of like the problem is ourselves has become so endemic on the left, but it's become a deflection activity. So for instance, another area of my research that I've written quite a lot about, and if you look at my most recent book where I talk about like the abyss and like the future just beyond the horizon, I kind of develop that more in significant emotions. It's about therapeutic politics, but it's also about our impasse and why therapeutic politics become so powerful. But it's like, we tried, we couldn't make it, and we don't know what to do. Where politics is in utter disarray. And so the project has been deflected back onto the human, where we become susceptible to all this like I don't even know what to call it. I hate this term grifting, but it's like we become susceptible to all these therapeutic grifts where it's like, I know, if only we could teach people how to get in touch with their inner blah, 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 raise your self-esteem, meditate, da, da, da. If only we could fix the subject somehow, some way, we will be able to overcome this problem finally. And it becomes this deflection. It's like, well, I don't really know what to do, so I'm going to do this. And maybe somehow, some way, it's going to fix the problem. And we've been doing that for decades, I think since the 1960s, where there was this palpable exhaustion after the Second World War. Like, you know, if you read, like I did this study once, which I never published, of student newspapers from the turn of the 20th century until the 1960s. And you can see, the 1930s, these students believe they are going to change the world in a fundamental way. They are having debates between people who think the future is Christian, the future is this, and the future is communist. And they're like, it's going to be one of these. They knew something powerful and profound was going to happen. They really believed they were on the edge of something. Then you have the Second World War, and almost immediately, the first article I found was in 1948, where people start talking about the wisdom of the East. And they start deflecting, and they start talking about, you get into the 50s, you start talking about psychedelics. Very, very early on, they start thinking about, they looked out into the world looked back at them, they were horrified, and they retreated into themselves. And that is really what happened in our culture. We've retreated into ourselves, and we've yet to come out. We think that there's something, if we could just fix it within the human, within ourselves, if I could just fix myself first, somehow, some way I'll fix society. It doesn't work like that. This is a deeply, deeply political world building project. We must, our hands are on history anyway. Are we going to direct it consciously, or are we going to take it where it's going to take us? We've got to direct it consciously. We don't have a choice. We've got to figure this out. And that takes an agentic subject. That takes a subject that recognizes its power and its autonomy, constrained though it is within our particular context, but recognizes that that is all there is anyway. That's all there is anyway, is humans. There's nothing else. It's not our nature. It's not something else guiding our hands. There's all these attempts to kind of reduce the human to something like a soul, where you've seen these studies that are constantly coming out like, oh, studies show that your inner subconscious is aware that you're going to press the button before you're even aware of it. And it's like, so there's like some kind of ghost in the machine or something that, and oh, therefore autonomy is a myth. They're doing this all the time. And what they're doing is they're trying to shore the individual. They're trying to, is that the word I'm looking for? They're trying to cut off autonomy from the individual, to put it up as a myth, because it's the most powerful thing that we have. And we, human beings are far, far, far from perfect. We're very, very fallible, but we're the best thing the world's got. We are, going back to Carl Sagan, we are the consciousness of the universe. That's extraordinary. We are the universe that has come to know itself. And we will, we are on this extraordinary path where we have actually improved our lives to an extraordinary extent. And we can continue doing that. But we're, as I keep saying, we're stuck. And we've got to figure out a way beyond the impasse. And that means that we have to embrace our autonomy and our reason and have a politics based on that we have the capacity for reason. It doesn't mean we get everything right, but we can sort it out. We can figure it out. We can debate with each other, and we can find solutions to problems. We found solutions to all kinds of problems, and we're giving up now. It's like, this is just it. Everything else is just human hubris. Maybe we should just throw ourselves down to nature, worship Gaia, and let things be. But no, I mean, even Gaia is a human construction. Like, there's no escaping it. So just embrace it. We have got to create a future for human beings. And, part of that is also being stewards of the earth, because we need the earth as human beings. And this was like, what I'm saying here is not at all controversial for anybody going up to before the Second World War. This was just like basic stuff. Even like the Nazis took this stuff for granted. They were like, oh shit, the Marxists are right. We better fight against them, or else they're going to have this classless society. But we want a class society. Like, we think that's actually the best way for human beings to live. So they knew. even they agreed that this was right. And now we've buried it in history.
Yeah, I so profoundly agree with you on all of this, and I'm just, so often hopeless when listening to fellow leftists, many of whom have the best intentions, I'm sure, but I think you really are one of the few people that get to the root of the problem and why we've been doing so terribly bad for so long. And I just hope more people engage with what you are suggesting, and really follow you, and you know, try to understand that these issues that we've been discussing here might actually be touching on some of the very roots of the problems of the left. And Ashley, where can people find you? Where can they buy your books, listen to you? Because I know you're active on YouTube and also other channels that I've loved listening to you on. Can you give us the most important spots where to find you?
Sure. I mean, I write sometimes weekly I write regularly for Compact. That's my authorial home at the moment. So that's where you can find most of my recent thinking. And at the moment, I am thinking about mass society and mass democracy and how important that has been historically, and how it has been continuously degraded. And you've had institutions like the EU that have grown up specifically to try and destroy it. And I'm kind of questioning, have they been successful? I'm not sure. And if they have been, what's the result of that? So that's my next thing that I've been working on. You can find that in Compact. So yeah, that's been my main home for probably the past year. I had been doing YouTube. You can go on YouTube and go on my Patreon. They're still available. And you can see my thinking about all sorts of things, including some things about Marxist economics. You can find the podcast that you mentioned. I don't upload new material because I have been focusing on my research. I had taken a break from... well, I say taken a break. I still published a couple of papers during that time, but I had taken largely a break. So I was trying to disseminate for a little while. And that's what I was doing. And now I've had to go back. I'm writing another book now, actually on the themes that we're talking about, on what I call a misanthropology. I got to think of a better sexy name for it so more people will read it. But the history of the destruction of the human and how to overcome that. So that's my new book that I've been working on. So I've kind of had to take a break from YouTube and Patreon, but you can go and access my whole back catalog. There, it's still all available. But I would also say, I think you should read as much heterodox economics as you can. I think that's really important. That's trying to understand where we are. I think a lot of people do really bad economics where they think they're being dialectical, where they just take like the phenomenon as it is presented to me, some kind of basic understanding of economics, and they slap it together and they're like, capitalism makes us mentally ill. Like, ooh, I'm a dialectician. No, you have to really unpack what you are being told and peel back layer. And that's what I try to do in my work and in my books, which you can find obviously in the normal places that you find these things, 2 books from Bloomsbury. But that's what I try to do. I study the phenomenon. I don't take for granted how it is presented. I really try to say, like, what's the story people are telling here? What are they actually trying to explain? And that's how I get down to the economics. And then I don't take the economics for granted either, because it's often quite counterintuitive. So I would say I really like Ted Rees. I try to support his work as much as I can. I was always a big fan of the TSSI school of Marxist value theory. So I recommend Andrew Kleiman and Alan Freeman and their work going back to the mid-2000s. Very, very important stuff. And it operates in debate, which I think is how you find the truth, is through, not being afraid to have your work sort of rigorously opened up in a good faith kind of atmosphere to find the truth, because it really, really matters. So I would recommend, I'm a cultural sociologist. That's what I do. I peel back layers of culture. But if you want to really just get to the nitty gritty of what's going on, what is our circumstance, what are we on the cliff overlooking, highly recommend the work of heterodox economists.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much for sort of giving us the background reading. And thank you so much for having joined us today. I'm very grateful to have had you on. And we will link everything down below so people can find it more easily. Ashley, thank you. We will keep listening to you. Thanks to everyone for listening to us today. I'm Tiare Gatti Mora. This is a MERA25 interview. Please subscribe and like this video to support us, and we will be back here very soon.